The Vikings came from the north, sweeping across Europe in waves of brutality and plunder. From Scotland to the Caspian Sea, their raids struck fear into all. Modern science and archaeology are shedding light on the real forces that drove their infamous expeditions. From the Russian plains to the North Atlantic, the Vikings were driven by more than just bloodlust. They were incredibly strategic and planned their raids for maximum profit and psychological impact. In the midst of starvation and chaos in Europe, some saw the Vikings' raids as a form of divine punishment. But these Viking warriors weren't just marauders, they were deeply affected by the harsh realities of their time. Archaeological findings from Estonia reveal something unexpected. Viking raids started a century earlier than previously believed. A team from Tallinn discovered graves with over 40 Viking skeletons, buried after a brutal battle. These men had been warriors, and their wounds tell a chilling tale. Researchers were stunned to find that these skeletons date back to before the first recorded Viking raid, uncovering evidence of Scandinavian presence in Eastern Europe long before written history mentions them. The Vikings were already raiding and trading long before they became infamous in the chronicles. The discovery of these early Viking raids shows how strategic and brutal they were. They were not just plundering for gold, they were sending a message of dominance. The remains of these men, buried respectfully despite their violent deaths, reveal the complexity of Viking warfare. By the mid-8th century, Vikings were already established along the rivers of Eastern Europe, trading and raiding. Their seafaring ways took them across the Caspian Sea, reaching places like modern-day Russia. In cities like Trousseau, they were not only traders but also warriors, establishing military bases to supply their campaigns. The Vikings weren't just about raiding, they were also explorers, leaving a network of trade routes stretching from the Baltic Sea to the farthest reaches of the North Atlantic. But with their expansion came inevitable conflict. The Vikings' raids were also a reaction to the Christian Empire's growth, particularly the expansion of Charlemagne's rule. His campaigns were seen as an affront by the pagan Vikings, and the violent Viking raids were partly a response to this pressure. The 8th century attack on the Lindisfarne Monastery, a sacred Christian site, marked a turning point. It was not just a raid, but a symbol of the clash between the pagan Viking world and the Christian European powers. By the early 9th century, Viking warriors had begun attacking the Frankish Empire, capitalizing on internal strife. They raided Paris, burning the city to the ground and taking advantage of the weakened empire. The Vikings' attacks were relentless. In England, they terrorized the kingdom for 2 decades, capturing cities and massacring leaders. York, once a Saxon city, became the Viking capital, a symbol of their dominance. The Vikings didn't just conquer, they left lasting marks on the regions they raided. In York, archaeologists have uncovered significant Viking artifacts, from combs to weapons, showing how deeply their influence reached. Despite their ruthless expansion, the Vikings were more than just invaders. Their complex relationships with the lands they plundered involved trade, negotiation, and sometimes even alliances. As they spread across England, the Vikings adapted, establishing their own form of governance in the territories they conquered. Viking expansion wasn't just driven by a thirst for riches, but also by political turmoil at home. Many Viking warriors fled their native lands, seeking fortune in foreign kingdoms. This internal unrest in Scandinavia fueled the Viking Age. From Sweden to the Baltic, Viking raids reached far beyond the familiar shores of England and France. Traders and raiders alike brought goods from across Europe, transforming the Viking heartlands into powerful trading hubs. Trousseau, a key Viking trading post, was both a center for commerce and a military outpost. The Vikings dominated trade routes, leaving a trail of wealth and power wherever they went. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were also traders, moving goods, slaves, and silver throughout Europe. Their presence along the rivers of Eastern Europe changed the course of history in ways still being uncovered today. By the 9th century, the Vikings had reached as far as the Black Sea and even Constantinople. Their far-reaching empire was a force to be reckoned with. In Iceland, a new chapter began for the Vikings as they settled in untouched lands, bringing with them their customs and governance. The Viking Age eventually waned, but their influence continued to shape Europe. Their violent expansion marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, a time of greater social and political change. The Vikings weren't just a band of marauders, they were a reflection of their time. The struggles they faced, the battles they fought, and the world they left behind have left an indelible mark on history. The Viking Age was violent, but it was also a time of exploration, trade, and profound transformation. By the year 1000, the Viking era had reached its peak, and what followed was an even bloodier century. Yet the legacy of the Vikings remains, a tale of warriors, traders, and explorers whose influence still echoes across the world.